From pop culture to politics, this is the Michael Medved Show.
And another great day in this greatest nation on God's green earth, and with the great nation hurtling toward the midterm elections, with a big primary election tomorrow coming up in the state of Maine. It's a time to focus on who it is who has dominated a lot of the coverage of the upcoming electoral battles. And to help us do that, no one better to turn to than Kevin Williamson, who is a national correspondent at the Dispatch and is based in Virginia. Prior to joining the company in 2022, he spent 15 years as a writer and editor at the conservative journal National Review. And he worked as a theater critic at the New Criterion. Kevin Williamson, a big honor to have you back. We're talking about a Graham Plattner, who is generally identified as an oyster farmer. His tattoo on his chest, the Totenkampf, Death's Head tattoo from the Nazi SS, has made him one of the more controversial figures. He's a Democrat. He's running to challenge Susan Collins, who's been a moderate Republican and several terms as senator from Maine. Why do you think, and what does it say about our country, that we have given so much attention to Graham Plattner and his foibles?
Well, I think in a sense he's kind of the Beto O'Rourke of this cycle, in that the Democrats know how to get your vote if you are a college-educated, middle-income, middle-class black woman who works for the government and lives in Philadelphia or Washington, D.C. or, Los Angeles, something like that. They know how to get the votes of those folks, and they're pretty good at it. But if you are a, rural or working-class, youngish white man, they don't really have a good idea of how to get your votes, and which has hurt them a lot in various elections. And so they've gone through a series of these kind of, great white hopes. So they thought that they were going to knock off Ted Cruz with Beto O'Rourke. They think they're going to knock off Susan Collins with Graham Plattner. My colleague Nick Catoggio had a good piece about this in the Dispatch the other day, in which he argued that the problem with Plattner is that he is the vision of what a kind of working class, blue collar white guy looks like to people who've never met one. He's kind of the television version of it. And because he's got a big mustache, and apparently he used to work as an oysterman, kinda. In truth, he seems to be sort of an upper middle class, prep school child of privilege who's been supported by his parents most of his life. And came back from the military, apparently had some personal problems, which I certainly sympathize with. People go through difficult things, and he was drinking a lot. He has a regrettable tattoo. I have some regrettable tattoos, although not SS tattoos. I think they're all regrettable, actually. I wish I didn't have any of them, but that's another story. So he's kind of, he's a social media troll, essentially. It's what he's been for most of his career. There's no reason for him to be in the Senate. And as I wrote in my piece that, again, I do sympathize with people who have the kind of problems that he's gone through. I do. But there's a difference between, Christian forgiveness and charity and saying, well, this guy also ought to be in the Senate. That's a question of prudence and political hygiene, which is an entirely different question.
Well, of course, this is your article, Nobody's Perfect is the title, indicates why it is that Graham Plattner shouldn't be in the Senate. Now, aside from the fact that he would be helping to give the Democrats a Senate majority, that he is a progressive and somebody who in the past has said that he could even be described as a socialist and a communist. So you suggest, and it's very eloquent and entertaining and persuasive, you suggest that there are also simply personal aspects of his life, not just a lack of experience or a lack of appropriate ideology, but personal aspects of his life that ought to disqualify him. What are those?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say, just to address something you brought up there for a second, it's not going to break my heart if the Democrats win a Senate majority. I think it might actually be a good thing for the country. I think the Republican Party is profoundly corrupt and a danger to the Republic, and I hope it gets stomped into goo and stomped real hard. And I hope they lose every race they're in. I couldn't vote for a Republican for any office that I could think of right now, given the state of the party and what it believes and the way it's oriented.
That includes Susan Collins?
I wouldn't vote for any Republican for national office today.
Okay.
If you're a member of the Republican Party, there's something wrong with you. And I've got friends who are Republican office holders, and there's something wrong with them. I tell them all the time, you got to stop doing this. But that aside, there's a question that I think about a lot because I've been writing about it. I may do a book on this one of these days, that personal morality and civic virtue are not the same thing, but they are related. There's some crossover in that Venn diagram. I often bring up Cato the Younger, who was he was the epitome of Republican virtue, but he was also a small R Republican. He was a Roman, it was long before the Republican Party. But he was also a drunk. He was what we would now call an alcoholic. He was constantly drunk in public. He had some personal moral failings. And the thing about Plattner is that his personal failings are fairly recent. They are the stuff that speaks to judgment and trustworthiness. And if this were something that had happened 20 years ago and he had put together a different kind of life since then and had established himself as the kind of person who had really matured and had a sort of more integrated adult grown-up personality and had got past these things, then I would probably be fine with that. There are people in public life who have had addiction problems and mental health problems and things like that, and it's fine. But you've got to get your act together first. And he seems to be a guy who hasn't really got his act together.
He's living at a house that is entirely paid for by his parents. And his parents and grandparents are very wealthy people. This is not somebody with a blue-collar background.
Yeah, there's a lot of sort of faking that stuff in that world. There's any number of kind of left-wing pundits and activists and office holders who play this, I come from the working class sort of thing. And then when you kind of look into it and say, not really. Not to say that there aren't any. There are some. But he's more like Bernie Sanders, this guy who's kind of like, have you ever had a job, like a real one, like that you had to get up and go to every day and you did it for 10 years? And it just doesn't seem like that's really the case. And so I don't like that cosplay, One of my favorite lines ever, and I can never find who to attribute it to, and I've really looked, but someone once described Bruce Springsteen's stage act as a white minstrel show. And that's a really, really good line. And that kind of describes, I think, both a lot of the Trump movement and but it's opposite number on the kind of more populist left. And the populist left and the populist right are a lot alike in that they have very similar economic policies. They have similar kinds of trollishness and attitudes, and they tend to attract a similar kind of lowlife, it looks like.
Well, what does that say about his military background? This is something that his supporters always bring up, is that he was a great patriot who went to fight for the United States in the Iraq War and I believe in Afghanistan also, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that, Pete Hegseth exists, and he's a good example of the fact that one can serve one's country in the military honorably and still be a dumbass. Who went to Princeton, a Princeton-educated dumbass.
Service, but not because of your service, but in spite of your service. I think the Pete Hegseth analogy is enough reason to understand that he doesn't deserve to be anywhere near public office, Democrat or Republican. Kevin Williamson, his column is posted at our website at michaelmedved.com. It is brilliant, it is insightful, and it is also very amusing. Do you think he becomes the next U.S. Senator from Maine?
If I were betting my own money on it, I would bet yes.
I would bet no, because there's more stuff still waiting to be exposed. At least that is the supposition. Kevin Williamson, always a pleasure speaking to you. We will be right back with more on Trump versus Meet the Press.
The Michael Medved Show.
Listen.
Nationwide.
Listen.
And around the world at michaelmedved.com.
And listen.
And on the Michael Medved Show, we need to get back to the remarkable and unprecedented appearance by President Trump on Meet the Press yesterday. And it really is an extraordinary example of President Trump and his deep suspicions and paranoia and falsehoods about the media and about his political opponents. One of the things that happened was that what provoked his immediate walk-off was a claim that the California primary election, in which actually the Republican candidate, Steve Hilton, did fine. He did better than expected. He was a clear winner who will be going into the general election that he has little chance of winning for governor in California, together with Xavier Becerra, who was the Democrat and leading vote getter. But President Trump was making a point that he believed that the recent primary elections in California were rigged. The transcript of the interview says that President Trump said the election was rigged. It was a dirty election, and it's happening again right now in California. It's 4 days, and they aren't even close to coming up with the... Do you know why they're doing that? Because they're cheating on the election. Okay, who are they supposedly cheating for? The Democrats, Xavier Becerra was the top vote getter, but it's not a surprise to anybody. California is a heavily Democratic state. And what exactly was the indication that he had that the election was a dirty election and being rigged in California, the primary, where a Republican was one of the winners? And pressed for evidence on the show, Trump said, all I have to do is look, and I listen. I listen to people. Well, he's obviously listening to the wrong people. This is the way it sounded when he finally stormed away from the interview in a tent on a farm facility in Wisconsin. Here is President Trump on Meet the Press with Kristen Welker of NBC. Clip 20.
Do you think it's appropriate that they have an election and 5 days later they're nowhere close to picking a winner?
State and local officials acknowledge they are slow. They're urging.
No, they're crooked.
They're urging the votes to be counted quicker. That's how they vote in California.
They're crooked, just like you're crooked. Your press is crooked, and Meet the Press is crooked.
To be fair, I'm not crooked, but let's
really.
Let's
well,
continue.
You play right into their hands.
Let's continue.
You're either crooked or you're stupid. You play right into their hands with this rap. You know that these elections are rigged. Your network knows that they're rigged. Do you know that I won an election in a landslide, and I got 94% bad press?
But, Mr. President,
you know why I got that? Because you have no credibility.
But you've never presented evidence that it was rigged. Let's keep talking about. I want to talk about Todd.
You have more evidence. There's more evidence than ever presented.
Let's talk
your
about
elections in this country. We're like a third world country.
But, sir,
your elections are crooked, and you're crooked, and Meet the Press is crooked, and so is ABC and CBS and CNN.
But, Mr. President,
you're one-sided crooked network. So let's call it quits because I've had enough. Thank you, darling. Have a good time.
Mr. President, let's please. I traveled all the way to Wisconsin.
I've sat
traveled I know. I traveled all the way to Wisconsin.
On and off in the rain, and I've given you enough time. You ought to straighten out.
Okay. Do you notice how he referred to her as darling? Which it was used almost as a put down. And Kristen Welker, after the dust cleared and President Trump walked out of the tent, was it a big tent? Did it have room for him to? I mean, again, up until that point, I think that as these things go, he was presenting fairly effective talking points. He was using some of the same distortions he uses traditionally and consistently, but it was not a disaster. This was not an idea of a media disaster would be Joe Biden and the debate that he had with Donald Trump, the debate that that ended Joe Biden's political career, because he was clearly so ill prepared for that debate and unable to engage in any meaningful way. Trump's performance here wasn't like that, but there is something terribly wrong when he loses all control and turns the debate into an attack on Kristen Welker, who, again, I've listened to it a couple of times now. During the course of their conversation up to that point, she had let him ramble on and on and on. She hadn't interrupted him. She hadn't made it difficult for him to speak. And there are none of her questions that were unfair. The idea of walking out of an interview, does anybody really believe that President Trump helped his own cause? And by the way, on this issue that he walked out on, the issue of the California election, where there is zero evidence of any kind of cheating going on, insisting that the cheating is going on and somehow the people at NBC and ABC and CBS and all the media are part of it. I don't believe that most Americans embrace that idea or that vision of how things work in our country. Here is Kristen Welker addressing Trump's walkout after it happened and trying to put it in context. Clip 12.
I spoke with President Trump on Saturday, and we both acknowledged the complications during the interview posed by the rain. He agreed to sit down with me for another Meet the Press interview.
Okay, he agreed to sit down for another Meet the Press. Well, that is a good thing. There is one point here about this issue of the long vote count in California. And the idea that the reason that liberals tend to do better later in long vote counts doesn't have to do with cheating. How do you explain it? We will get to that and to more coming up on the Medved Show. And on the Michael Medved Show, breaking news that Iran said that it is halting its strikes against Israel, at least for the time being, but will resume hostilities if the Israel Defense Forces continue to attack Lebanon. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu later said the war against Iran and its Lebanon-based proxy Hezbollah has not yet ended. President Donald Trump insisted that final peace negotiations are ongoing, and I think most of the world hopes that those negotiations will prove successful. What's important here is that Israel is not attacking Lebanon, has not been attacking Lebanon. They have been attacking Hezbollah, which is a terrorist organization which hasn't stopped its attacks on Israel. And one of the things that could be a positive development of this entire war and any kind of settlement would be dissociating the government of Lebanon even more than it has dissociated itself from the terrorists in Hezbollah, who occupy a good bit of territory in the southern parts of the nation of Lebanon. Meanwhile, there is this story from the AP. John Mellencamp, Jay Leno, and comedian Whitney Cummings will be among the guest speakers when Bill Maher receives the Mark Twain Award for American Humor during a June 28th ceremony at the Kennedy Center. The center disclosed the list today in an email sent out to members who were offered packages ranging from $99 for a seat reservation for this event to $1,500 and more for seating and admission to pre- and post-show receptions. The announcement also marks a notable change in how the center is identifying itself. A notable, and I should say for most people, a welcome change. The news came from the Kennedy Center, not the Trump Kennedy Center, a switch that also appears on the center's homepage. And that switch was mandated by a judicial decision that said that given the fact that the Kennedy Center was named and created through an act of Congress, you can't change the name without a comparable act of Congress, which I think it would be very hard to win. The idea of the Trump Kennedy Center has never been a particularly comfortable renaming. Meanwhile, they're honoring Bill Maher, and well-deserved, because Bill Maher has been one of the most consistent and open-minded, and both sides are often to blame in the Bill Maher universe in terms of his commentary and his humor, which is penetrating and piercing and useful. And for instance, on Real Time, Bill Maher asked this about the recent shakeup at 60 Minutes at CBS. And some of the conversation involved Bill Maher and his guest, Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, one of the leading Democratic liberals in the U.S. Senate. This is Bill Maher on Real Time, clip 4.
Till I see a smoke. What does the panel think of the recent shakeup at 60 Minutes? I'm for it. Good night. No. Let me ask you this question. I watch 60 Minutes every week. I've had since I was a kid. If I didn't hear all the buzz in the media, if I didn't read about it all the time, would I ever notice that it was any different? I don't think I would.
Yeah, it's not.
Would you?
It's not just 60 Minutes, and part of it is
I
you
agree.
don't know what they choose not to. You don't know what they choose not to air.
That's true too.
Part of what the allegation is that they are killing stories that would be embarrassing for the president. So it's hard to know what you're missing in a censorship environment.
But I've seen ones that are not very favorable to the president.
Yeah,
that's what I'm saying. I don't know if I would have noticed any different if I hadn't been reading about it. Also, I just don't think being a 60 Minutes correspondent is that hard. I don't feel like Scott Pelley was a national treasure. Companies change hands all the time. I never liked him. Sorry, I just never did. Companies change hands. People bring in their own people, their new ownership. You know, just because something changes doesn't mean. I feel like we see everything through such a partisan lens. Oh my God, 60 Minutes has a new cast. So does Saturday Night Live.
Okay, that again is an indication of why I think that Bill Maher is an appropriate choice for this annual award for American comedy. Because the best comedy is really not just lighthearted. It can be penetrating and illuminating and providing some welcome perspective. Okay, meanwhile, there is breaking news from Reuters. A federal judge today struck down a $100,000 fee that U.S. President Donald Trump had imposed on new H-1B visas for highly skilled foreign workers, concluding that it constituted an unlawful tax that Congress never authorized. A U.S. District Judge Leo Sorokin in Boston issued the ruling. And that was a lawsuit filed by 20 Democratic state attorneys general challenging a fee the Trump administration announced in September that dramatically raised the cost of obtaining H-1B visas. And then there is this from the Associated Press NORC, National Opinion Research Centers for Public Affairs Research, and the results of a new poll. The Associated Press reports, as the U.S. prepares for an extravagant celebration of its founding principles, fewer Americans see our country as exceptional. That new poll finds. The survey from AP NORC, Center for Public Affairs Research, highlights many Americans' feeling of unease over the future of our representative, particularly among young people. It presents a jarring contrast as communities across the country commemorate the nation's 250th anniversary. Only about 1/4 of Americans say the U.S. stands above all other countries in the world, the new poll found. I find that appalling. In other words, if the U.S. doesn't stand alone above all other countries in the world, then there are countries that are better than us. Which are they? They're not there. That's the truth. While 44% say we are one of the greatest countries in the world, it's still a minority, along with some others. About 3 in 10 say there are better countries than the U.S., an increase from 19% in an AP NORC poll conducted in June of 2016. Americans remain divided about whether diversity is an essential feature of our identity. There's also a separate poll that shows a surprising number of Americans feel political violence is justified. But who are most likely to think that political violence is justified? We'll get to that coming up on the Medved Show. And talking about a brand new poll from the Associated Press, a poll released today that is appropriate for the 250th anniversary of our country coming up to the glorious 4th of July that we all anticipate eagerly. As the U.S. prepares for an extravagant celebration of our founding principles, fewer Americans see our country as exceptional, which is stunning and, frankly, appalling. Only about 1/4 of Americans, 25%, say the U.S. stands above all other countries in the world, while 44% say it's one of the greatest countries in the world. That's a minority, along with some others. What is truly stunning about this, and I think is a reflection of President Trump's impact on our politics and on the mood of the country and the way people feel about our nation. Now, 3 in 10, 30%, say there are better countries in the world than the U.S. That has changed since Trump's arrival in national politics. They had a previous poll in 2016 that asked the same question. And instead of 30% saying there are better countries in the world, it used to be 19%. So it's nearly doubled the number of people who say there are better places. And by the way, this goes along with figures about Americans who become expatriates, who decide to go elsewhere. And there are wonderful countries in the world. This is not my belief that it is certainly not my belief in any sense that every other country in the world is a wreck or a disaster or negative, but they're not the United States. And then there's this that came from the same AP poll, Associated Press NORC poll. Americans remain divided about whether diversity is an essential feature of the U.S. identity, and agreement about other aspects of the country's underlying character those agreements appear to be eroding, the survey found. Americans are less likely to see a democratically elected government as extremely or very important to the United States identity as a nation. There's far fewer people who think that a democratically elected government is essential for America to be America, which is a blindness and extremely disturbing. The Americans are less likely to see a democratically elected government as extremely or very important to the United States identity as a nation. What is then important to our identity as a nation? If we do not consider a democratically elected government as most important to us, what is it? Professional sports? What is it that makes America America? And the idea that you could somehow destroy or remove or undermine democratically elected government and still have the country that we love and honor, that is a very misleading and destructive idea and a very destructive direction to take our national self-image. The 2/3 of U.S. adults now say a democratically elected government is highly important to the U.S. identity as a nation. Since 2021, again, and since this Trump era in which we all live, before then, in 2021, 80% saw a democratically elected government as highly important. And now far fewer people believe that it is crucial to our national identity to have a democratically elected government. And going along with that is another Ipsos poll, which is also full of its own disturbing contents. Over 35% of Americans say that political violence is justified to achieve a political goal. That's up from 32% last year. Now, this is not evenly divided among Americans. More than half of MAGA Republicans hold the view that political violence is justified, compared to 32% of Democrats. In other words, half of Democrats think political violence is justified, which is appalling. And a more than half of MAGA Republicans hold that view. And of Republicans in general, it's a third. Ouch. Very painful and very worrisome. And this is a response to a poll of 8,000 Americans. Meanwhile, the question of freedom of the press and the idea of the importance of an operating press that is not controlled by the government. Yes, Scott Pelley, who had found his distinguished career at CBS cut short by his firing, compared his firing from 60 Minutes to "It's like your spouse was murdered." Here's what he had to say about his experience running into outside pressure that impacted his career.
Well, if we want to talk about it at an emotional level, the best thing that I can imagine in terms of describing it is that it's like your spouse was murdered. There's some moments of the day I feel fine. There are some moments of the day that I just frankly fall apart when I least expect it. Not that there's any particular trigger. But I do want to be clear that I do not feel sorry for me. I don't care about me. I'm fine. I care about these people that I left behind, the people who are still trapped there, and this institution that I love so much. You said that I've been there 37 years. I've been married 42 years. So that's the depth of my devotion.
Yeah, that is a wound that he sustained. Scott Pelley also said this about honor and courage at CBS and their survival of those qualities. Listen.
They don't know what they're doing. And there's a subtle political bias that I've never seen at 60 Minutes before. And so, or at CBS News before. And so that is my hope, a return to sanity, a return to honor, a return to courage. We used to have all of those things in abundance, and now we don't. We can save this. It's possible to land this plane. But right now, CBS News, in my view, is on fire.
And again, an effective communicator warning about the situation. Meanwhile, President Trump, in his spat with the media and his walking out on 60 Minutes, there has been an evaluation of his new claim that led to his walkout, really. His new claim that the California primary election was rigged. How does this rank among conspiracy theories? We'll also talk about the fascination nationally with Graham Plattner. Why is he an object of so much attention in this greatest nation on God's green earth?